If the Germans succeeded in breaking through at Mortain, the Allied position beyond that area would be grave.
The air cooperation of the U.S. 9th Air Force and the RAF against the enemy attack was extraordinarily effective. The Royal Air Force had a large number of Typhoons equipped with rocket-firing devices. These kept up a sustained assault against the enemy's forces that was of great help to the defending infantry.
Successfully withstanding the brunt of the Nazi attack, the Allies now moved to encircle the forward Nazi units. This maneuver was to be accomplished by a double thrust, by the Canadian First Army toward Falaise and by the U.S. Third Army toward Argentan. Patton's Third Army split into two major groups, one section driving straight eastward from Laval, and the other swinging around the Nazis' flank and driving north into the German position at Argentan.
By the night of August 13th, the U.S. 5th Armored Division was in the outskirts of Argentan. The French 2nd Armored Division was nearby, and the U.S. 79th and 90th Divisions were in close support.
Caught in the giant pincers between Falaise and Argentan, the Germans suffered staggering casualties. Thousands killed and wounded in only a few days' fighting.
In the aggregate, considerable numbers of Germans succeeded in getting away. Their escape, however, meant an almost complete abandonment of their heavy supply and was accomplished only by terrific sacrifices.
Meanwhile, the Canadian drive into the Germans' flank from the north at Falaise met determined Nazi resistance. By driving south through Falaise, the Canadians planned to join forces with the Americans near Argentan and thus completely encircle the forward Nazi attacking units. If this operation was successful, the roads across France would be open to Allied use, and nothing could stop an all-out Allied chase of the disorganized enemy to the banks of the Rhine. The battle on the Germans' northern flank was one of the most concentrated actions in the campaign on the continent. Against desperate resistance, the Canadian First Army troops hit the enemy in a direct frontal assault.
The Canadians threw in fierce and sustained attacks, but it was not until August 16th that Falaise was finally captured.
3 days later, near the little town of Chambois, the pincers closed as the Canadian Army, which took Falaise, met the Americans who seized Argentan, and a large Nazi force was effectively trapped. Many of the Nazi prisoners were disarmed and searched by French patriots who volunteered eagerly for the job. Though a considerable number of German troops escaped eastward toward the River Seine, more than 100,000 Nazi soldiers were caught within the circle and taken prisoner by the Allies.
8 infantry divisions and 2 panzer divisions were captured almost in their entirety.
For the Germans, the encirclement of thousands of their crack troops was supplemented by the loss of great quantities of invaluable materiel, which they could not immediately replace.
The battlefield at Falaise was unquestionably one of the greatest killing grounds of any of the war areas. Roads, highways, and fields were so choked with destroyed equipment and with dead men and animals that passage through the area was extremely difficult.
The Battle of the Falaise Pocket ended according to plan.
While the bulk of Bradley's forces was engaged in this great battle, General Middleton's 8th Corps turned back to the westward to overrun the Brittany Peninsula. He made a rapid advance and invested Saint-Malo, the small port on the north coast. The garrison resisted fanatically, but Middleton was able, with cooperating air and naval forces, to bring to bear enough power to reduce it by August 14th. although remnants of the garrison held out for 3 more days.
For weeks, the 8th Corps assaulted the Nazi defenses on the Brittany Peninsula before the enemy capitulated. The German garrison, what was left of it, surrendered after an exhausting siege. Some of the defenders had obviously fortified themselves with alcohol during the drawn-out battle and were most uncooperative about answering questions put to them by their captors. The goal of every Allied soldier, from private to general, who set foot on the soil of France in the summer of 1944, was Paris. For General Jacques Leclerc, commander of the French 2nd Division, which had fought brilliantly in the desert campaign in Africa against Rommel, this goal had a special meaning. The moment when the French capital would finally be freed drew excitingly close as the Allies rolled victoriously through the crowded streets of newly liberated French towns. This was the momentous day the townsfolk had dreamed about for 4 long years. For in June 1940, with the arrival of the Nazi troops, the gay city that was Paris had changed into a somber, spiritless German garrison town, which the Nazis planned to turn into a playground for the military. Everywhere there were German uniforms. The conquering Nazi soldiers who had marched into Paris in June were replaced by special occupation troops. And always there was a steady flow of German fighting men back from the fronts for liberty. The City of Light became a city of sorrow under the shadow of the swastika. From the day they occupied it, the Nazis fell to work on transforming the face of the city. Evidences of this metamorphosis on every side reminded doleful Parisians that their city was no longer theirs. As expected, the Nazis, with their Gestapo, ruled Paris with an iron hand. With the German military in complete control, the city became an armed camp and functioned in an atmosphere of suspicion and distrust under the strict surveillance of the ubiquitous Nazi soldiery. Even traditional French ceremonies were conducted under the watchful eye of the conquerors. However, Parisians did succeed in keeping the torch burning at the tomb of their unknown soldier of World War I throughout the Nazi occupation. But the Nazi occupation forces did not supervise everything that went on in Paris and the surrounding country. From the outside world came the voices of freedom. Voices like General de Gaulle, urging his countrymen to remain firm in their trust in the final victory for France and its people. Loyal Frenchmen did not merely mark time during the occupation. Soon after the Germans imposed their rule, resistance groups sprang up all over the country. Seizure of ammunition had a high priority on the list of resistance activities aimed at undermining the Nazis at every opportunity. Demolition of rail lines had a crippling effect on Nazi movements of troops and equipment. A true picture of what was actually happening in France and in the free world outside was presented in the pages of resistance newspapers, published secretly and distributed to Frenchmen eager for a few words of hope. Hundreds of underground newspapers were published during the occupation under overwhelming handicaps. The Allies sometimes managed to drop supplies to those groups who were among the most active in the resistance. The Maquis, whose members hid in the hills to avoid being forced into Nazi labor gangs. With this badly needed equipment, the Maquisards operated as guerrillas and sometimes killed several hundred Nazi soldiers in surprise attacks. After D-Day on the Normandy beaches, the various Maquis groups were organized into the FFI, French Forces of the Interior, to assist Allied troops in the destruction of the enemy. In mid-August, with Allied armies only a few kilometers from Paris, The resistance opposition to the Nazis flared into open insurrection. The long-planned revolt began to take shape. All Parisians knew the Allies were not far off, and their mounting hate toward their Nazi rulers at last came fully out into the open. The National Resistance Council had planned thoroughly for the day of vengeance. They concluded their preparations coolly and waited for the right moment to strike. Finally, on August 19th, the resistance opened fire. Once started, the insurrection quickly gained momentum. The revolt was successful in one sense. Numbers of the enemy were killed, and German administrators in key civil posts were put to rout. The German grip on Paris was effectively loosened by the FFI. But many felt that the revolt was premature. It soon became apparent that the Parisians were not quite strong enough to win back their city completely without aid.
When the Free French forces inside Paris staged their uprising, it was necessary to move rapidly to their support. Information indicated that no great battle would take place, and it was believed that the entry of one or two Allied divisions would accomplish the liberation of the city. For the honor of first entry, General Leclerc's French 2nd Division was selected. It was a satisfying climax to an odyssey which, in its entire length, carried all the way from Central Africa to Berchtesgaden in Germany.
General Leclerc's men entered Paris on August 24th and immediately restored the city officially to French authority. For 50 months, Parisians had waited for this moment when they could again breathe the air of freedom so long denied them. Overnight, Paris was once again gay and happy. The people's unshakable trust in the return of a free France had proved sound. Liberty, equality, fraternity was again the standard. But the French soldiers still had the enemy to contend with. General Leclerc's tank crews and American Shermans used their experience gained at Le Mans and Alençon to good advantage. Paris again became a battleground. Many of its most fashionable avenues were under constant enemy sniper fire. To assist the French 2nd Division, elements of the American 4th Division were sent in, and American and French soldiers fought side by side in what was inevitably an unplanned action. The skirmish in the Paris area continued throughout the greater part of 2 days. Allied tanks proved invaluable as street fighting weapons. With the last remnants of the Nazi defenders dead or captured, the Germans surrendered to the Allies on August 25th. The Nazi soldiers who had strutted around Paris with such a show of invincibility presented a far different picture. They fully realized the hate Parisians had grown to have toward them and seemed to anticipate far from gentle treatment now that the positions were reversed. The city was formally surrendered to the Allies by General Dietrich von Holtitz as commander of the Nazi garrison, which had dwindled to 12,000 men.
Immediately after the capture of Paris, I notified General de Gaulle that I hoped he would quickly enter the capital. I desired that he, as the symbol of French resistance, should make an entrance before I had to go in or through it.
The victory celebration was quickly thrown into disorder by sudden bursts of machine gun and rifle fire. The crowds near the Cathedral of Notre Dame were directly in the line of fire of the rooftop snipers, who were clearly Vichy militiamen and French collaborationists. The shooting spread. Soon they were shooting all over central Paris. When any of this group of snipers were caught, they fared far worse at the hands of the Parisians than had the Germans captured during the earlier fighting.
On the Saturday following the capture of Paris, I determined to make a formal call upon General de Gaulle. We entered Paris quietly and secretly, as we supposed, on Sunday, August 27th. Word apparently got out that Bradley and I were in town, and we were surrounded by a crowd of enthusiastic citizens. The exuberant greetings were a bit embarrassing, and we made our way as quickly as possible to one of the exit gates. I promised de Gaulle that 2 of our divisions would march to the front through the main avenues of the city. I declined personally to be present at this formation, but told him that General Bradley would come back to the city and stand the review to symbolize Allied unity.